Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. I'm going to share with you 4 different ways to cut something called a rabbet or a rebate joint. If you're new to woodworking, this is really important. It might be a refresher if you've been around a while. Stick with me and I'll show it to you. In the opening statement, I made reference to both a rabbet and a rebate. If you're in North America, we tend to call it a rabbet, and if elsewhere, you tend to call it a rebate. Either way, it is a recess cut on the edge of a board. Think of the back of a cabinet, and in simple terms, here's how it goes. There's your relatively thin back, and it would fit in like that, nice and neat. Not the nicest way to do it, but there are applications where this actually works extremely well, and it's well suited for the design. And what I want to do is I want to show you a couple examples, might get the wheels turning on how you may be able to utilize it in the future. My first method of cutting a rabbet is going to be using something called a skew block plane. I'll explain that in just a second, but let me tell you what I'm doing on this. So here's my cabinet side. This is my back, and I'm going to fit it in like this. So what I like to do is get as much surface area or purchase over here as possible, which means instead of having a really shallow rabbet, I'm going to move it over so I've got about that much. Now, I don't want to leave this piece too weak, so I'm going to balance that. And this is about a 3/4 inch piece of poplar, so I'm going to leave a little less than 1/4 of an inch. And this can vary with the wood, depending on the species. So I'm going to scribe a line along here. And then my depth, and I always like to set it so that it's a little bit deeper than the wood is thick. That way you don't end up having something stick out. And if you want to, you can come in afterwards and just flush that little bit that's left over so that it ends up being a nice transition between the side and the back. So on the inside, I'm going to cut score a line. Now there's a problem with using this type of a tool, and that is there is no control in terms of cutting down into here. Now I got 2 ways. I could either cut it this way, which is taking a little tiny strip off, or I can put it in the vise, which will actually speed it up a little bit. I've added a wooden fence to mine, so I give it a little more reference. So the first thing I have to do is get the blade set. Now, some of these come with a little nicker right there, and the little nicker is designed to score the grain ahead of the blade. That's only important if you're cutting across the grain like this. That's going to leave a rough surface because you literally just have the blade is cutting across, and it's going to leave somewhat of a ragged finish. What you would do is have that little nicker sharpened. You put it down, make sure that it lines up with the edge of the blade, and that'll go ahead of the blade and score a nice, neat line. I find it's easier to actually work to a gauge line. So what I'm going to do is set up my blade. I always like to have it sticking out just a little bit beyond the edge instead of trying to work with that perfectly flush. I get it set so that the blade is projecting parallel to the sole, so I'm going to move that fence over so I get more blade to look at. And I'm going to loosen this up just a little bit. Advance that blade a little bit more. Need to move it over just a little bit to the side. And that appears to be good, and it's still sticking out. So at that point, I'll tighten up that spin wheel. Now when I put this on board, I'm going to adjust my fence. I'm focusing right here where the edge of the point of the blade is. I'm going to get that right on that gauge line. And when I do, I then will lock my fence. Now, the other downside to using this tool is if the grain is going in the opposite direction, it's going to tear. There really isn't an adjustable throat here, so there's not a whole lot you can do about that. However, the surface you're cutting is going to be hidden underneath the back, so it's really not a big deal. Now you want to try to keep your plane so that it is the bottom of this is parallel to that, so that you're not leaning one way or the other. I always use my finger to keep the fence tight against this inside face so that when it engages, everything is lined up. This hand is more or less just supporting the weight. This hand is keeping everything registered with the board. Now you want to make sure that your blade engages right there at the beginning, picks up a shaving. Now I've got it set for a fairly heavy cut, just so I can get down through there a little quicker. And I'll do this in the same fashion I'm doing it now until I get close to the line. And then I'll have to go in probably and adjust by taking a little more off of one end to the other, depending on which one I'm getting closest, which one is farthest away from that gauge line that I drew. Now I can't explain why, but you'll notice that I'm closer to my line up here than I am back there. It must be just the way that we use the plane. So what I need to do while I still have room to catch up is bring this surface parallel to the line and closer to where that one is. So what I'll do is just make some partial cuts, meaning I'll go in there about 3 or 4 inches and then lift the plane while I'm in a forward motion so that my cut stops somewhere around here, but I don't end up leaving a skin tag, which is what I call it. That's what I mean. Then you got to go in and peel it off so that that doesn't interfere with the way the plane reads the surface. Okay, now while I have time and room, I want to check to make sure that this surface is square to the back or square to this face, and I can use a combination square so that I can project the blade just as far as I need to, and then go in there and read off of that. And it seems to be that it's all right. So I'll just continue on until I get closer to the line. Okay, now I'm close to the line. I still have my line on here, but I've only 3 or 4 strokes away from being right on it. And it looks like this surface is parallel to that line, so if I just keep doing what I'm doing, it should work out. Okay, that looks like it's there. And my rabbet, or my back, would just fit into that rabbet nice and neat. Now I actually could have gone a little bit deeper, although that's flush right now, but depending on what you want, and depending on how precise you can do it, you may want to make it just a little bit deeper so that it would allow you to come in and flush this up. Now that hasn't been planed, so I actually would want the opportunity to have that just a little bit deeper. Now I can come in, glue that in place, and then go in and just carefully flush this up so it's nice and or it aligns perfectly with that back. Now, if you don't have a skew block plane, there are other planes that have a blade that goes right to the edge that still allow you to do that. Now, as what's important is you've got to be able to cut right into or right up against a vertical surface. So this is a rabbeting bench plane. Actually has tilting handles. It's quite fancy, but you'll notice that the blade goes all the way to both sides. So I have the option of using that one. This is a rabbeting block plane, which blade is perpendicular, not skewed. Goes to both sides, so you have access on either edge. A little shorter, obviously. And then there's your series of shoulder planes, and they can do the same thing. They come in various sizes, but again, it allows you to get right to the edge. So the only difference is I don't have a fence, so I'm going to have to provide one. So I'm going to go ahead and do it the same way I would in terms of laying it out. So go in there. I won't cut this one as deep. Put a gauge line for my depth, and then measuring the thickness of my back plus a little. We'll go in there and run a line on the inside face. So this is going to be the cabinet side. Now, I've got to put something in there for a fence. So I'm going to grab a piece of MDF. I've got to switch to a area of my bench that will allow me to clamp in from behind. It can't be out here in front of the plane. And I like to use my marking gauge when I do this just to set it up more than just judging by eye. So I'm going to get it close. I'll put a clamp on both ends. Now I'm going to use my gauge. Oh, I've got to make sure that that's coming out beyond the bench so it doesn't interfere. Use my gauge to make sure. That needs to be tapped over a little bit. That's tight. That's tight. Snug those up. Now I also have to prepare my plane. We'll use this little one. And when I say prepare it, we have to have that blade perfectly flush with the side that's going to run up against the fence. And the blade is almost always going to be a little bit wider than the body of the plane. So the first thing I'm going to do is check and make sure it's parallel. Now I'm going to push it on the opposite side by pushing down on the side of another plane, and that's going to make that stick out just a little bit beyond. And then on the side that's going to run up against the fence, I'll do this, push down hard, so that should be nice and flush. Check it to make sure that it's parallel. We want to take off the same amount with each pass. And don't have a whole lot of reference surface here. I'm only cutting a strip that's maybe 1/4 of an inch, and this is a relatively wide and heavy plane, so I've got to pay close attention to that. Now, it doesn't really eject the shavings the way I would like. The skew block plane has a tendency to throw them off to the side. This one I got to reach in there each time and pull it out. And what you'll find that this has a tendency to step on you. Even though I lined that up, for whatever reason, it ends up knocking itself over just a little bit with each pass, but I can go back in and fix that. But I've got a fair bit of material to remove, so I'll get at it. Okay, once the fence has done its job for me, which is get me started, I can remove this. It's a little bit easier to not have that fence in the way. Now I've got my marking gauge still set, so I'm going to come in here and make sure. And you can see that that was doing, as I mentioned, it was actually stepping on me. A good deep grade gauge line. Now I put this back. I just want it to hang out over just a little bit so I can go in there and make corrections with my marking gauge while I've got this in place. Now I'm going to take a chisel and just go in there and clean that little bit out. Now I've got enough of a shoulder there that I can go in with my plane and follow that. And now it's just a series of multiple passes until I get close to that line where I can make some judgment calls as to whether or not I've kept this surface parallel to the line, correcting as I need. Now that I've got a well-established wall, I'm going to switch and try these other planes as well. This is not my favorite way of doing it. This tool is not... I shouldn't say not well balanced. It's well balanced. It's just you've got so much of it off of the wood, and it's small and a little bit difficult to hold on to. Although that knob right there in the front works, and I use my finger on the underside to run along the face of the board, which also helps. But you've got to balance it this way. In doing this, I have to stop several times and come in with my marking gauge, which is a great tool, and go in there and make sure that back wall is staying square to the face being cut, and then take my chisel to go in and remove that little feather of wood so that the plane will not be prevented from laying against that back wall. I'm going to try the 3/4 shoulder plane, and it gets set up the same way. First thing I want to do is get that blade projecting so that it's parallel to the sole. You don't have a whole lot of adjustment with a shoulder plane. There's very little lateral adjustment. So you've got to make sure that when you sharpen, grind your blade, that you keep it so that it is parallel to the sole when it projects. I want that side to be flush, so up against a flat, hard surface, I'll push down on that. Now the way I hold this is I tuck my fingers up underneath here, squeeze it right here, and then put my thumb right here to help keep some pressure to keep this from dropping down at the back. This finger is pushing up against this side of the plane to keep it tight to that wall. And it's the same process. Just multiple passes. I'm going to take a little heavier cut. But the way the shaving comes, you almost always have to stop and pull it out in order to prevent it from getting squeezed in between that wall and the side of the plane. Take a look. We're getting close, but not quite. All right, I'm going to do one more. I'm going to use my rabbeting plane. Get that blade parallel to the sole. I consider this a great joinery plane. Now I need to have that a little bit tighter. Same idea, you need that to be flush on the side that's going to work against the fence. There's what I mean by knickers. So you would sharpen those, loosen that screw, drop it down, but you have to make sure that everything is in line, meaning that that's obviously going to be in line with the plane, but the blade has to be in line with the edge of the plane as well. When I was cutting the rabbet to put this back in, this piece I was able to plow all the way through, do it the way we've been doing it. But this piece had to be stopped right here and right there. Well, you can't do that with any of the tools that we've used to date. You can only do that with a router plane or a chisel and a hammer, but that would be even slower. So the first thing I'm going to do is come in and, same as before, mark my depth. This one I'm going to go a little bit deeper. And when I put this in place, I want this to hang over just a little bit. You'll see why. I always like to put that in and then knock those dogs down. And what they'll do is they'll pull that piece down tight to the bench top. Now this is going to be slow simply because you can only remove a small bit at a time without applying a whole lot of extra effort, and it takes a little bit longer to adjust. Now I'm taking about a 1/16 of an inch, maybe a little less than that. That's going to be a pretty heavy cut. I'm going to put this in place, but I made a fence, which is just a scrap with a cutout for the cutter, and I'll put that in there. So the edge of the cutter is right on the gauge line. And this is one of the reasons why I added this auxiliary bottom. Makes it easier to be able to clamp to. And you want that fence to be fairly long so you have lots of reference against the edge of the board. So I've got lots here to keep that engaged. This is a heavy enough cut. I may actually reach down there and pull some of that out as it's being removed. I prefer to pull this one as opposed to push. I'll do a second pass just to make sure it's nice and clean. Now, I'll just hand tighten that. I usually like to go in there and snug it up with a screwdriver, but in this case, advance it, snug it up. Now I'm cutting in pine, so that's pretty easy, but you get it hardwood, you're not going to be able to take as heavy of a cut. And the nice thing about this is you can set your cutter for the final depth. No guesswork. And you got a nice clean rabbet that your back will sit in. Okay, rabbet on a table saw is relatively easy, except, and I'm going to explain that one exception in a minute, but the first thing we want to do is determine where we're going to go. So I'm going to leave about this much on the back side, and then we want to take it the depth plus a little, so about there. So I'll set my, now I want to make sure that I'm not going to trap a piece in here, so I think what I'll do is I'll make this cut first, I'll make the second cut with this standing on, and that'll leave that piece free. So I'll set my table saw to the height of that line. there. Make that pass. And once we've got that one, we've got to set it to the height. I'll do a test pass on it and then adjust our fence. A little bit too far. Piece falls away harmless, and we've got our rabbet we can set that piece into. Now, what do we do if we can't go all the way through? So let me explain how we do a stopped rabbet using the table saw. Okay, let's assume we are going to have a stopped rabbet on both ends. So I'm going to come in here. We'll come to within a ½ inch of the end. Do it on both sides. And then we'll just transfer that mark with a square. So let's get this set up first. So I'll set the height of the blade so that it's right on that line. Run it through the top of the arc so I make sure I'm not too deep. Now, next thing I need to do is find out where the blade starts and stops cutting. So I'll bring my fence over with a square, something square, and just push that down so tooth is not touching the wood. Find a writing utensil that works. And then we need to go on the opposite side as well. So just push that forward until it no longer makes contact. Now I need to transfer these lines. So I've got to bring them over here and put them on the fence as well. So what I'll do is I'll go in here and set this, I'm going to go just a little bit more. And then I'll put a block of wood in here, clamp it to the fence. So that's going to allow me, no, wrong one. I should have had that lined up here. I moved it and put it in the wrong spot. So I'm going to turn this on, I'm going to drop it down like this, and then I'm going to go forward until those two lines set up, and then I'll stop the cut. We stop right on our line. We're a little bit before it, but that's okay. We've got to do some chisel work there anyway. Now we're going to do a cut like this. We're going to have to change our marks because we're going to adjust the height of the saw. Okay, so now we've got to get rid of the rest of the material, but the good news is the majority of it's done for us. So let's go back over to the bench. I think the safest way to do this is just with a chisel. So come back here 1/4 inch or so away. You can't just drive that down there. You have to create some relief. So as you keep moving forward, it allows your chisel to go a little bit deeper each time. And I'll come back here and remove a chunk of this. Now you can easily push a chisel through this material by hand, but I like using the mallet simply because it gives you lots of control. We'll come back and do this end same way. And then the opposite end, we would do it the exact same way. And when you're done, you've got a nice, clean, stopped rabbet. Your other piece obviously would be able to go all the way through and then apply your back. Now, there's other ways you can cut a rabbet. You can cut them with a router. And that's sometimes efficient, but I just find that a router has a tendency often to do a lot more tearing. It's such a small diameter cutter. But there's lots of times when that happens to be the best tool. But of these methods, I think combination of the table saw, the chisel, and the router plane probably give you as fast and as accurate a work as you're going to need. Anyway, good luck with this. Hope you enjoy it. If you like my work and enjoy my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos and help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said, better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the link below, the chisel and plane icon, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our online and in-person workshops.